right now at this moment, or at least at the time I wrote the case of reparations, I don't know where it's at right now. I believe that basically white people have 20 times the wealth as African Americans. If you're going about families, so if you look at your average African American family, they have about 1/20 of the wealth of your average white family. If you broaden this out and go from families and start looking at neighborhoods, a lot of people talk about, we can't ignore the same topic with African Americans. When we control income, we still see these discrepancies. And this is something that I should have known knowing how I grew up. There is no African American middle class in the American popular sense of an African American class. So not only are you dealing with a population of people who may make a certain amount of money, maybe a generation that get to a certain level, but they're one generation out of it usually, maybe two generations. And the way they are out of it is not the way that most white people are out of it. I may come to a school like Cornell, do really well, go get a nice job as a lawyer, but the fact of the matter is my younger brother, y'all say my younger brother probably won't do so well. I may have to help out with him. I may have to help out with my mother. I come from a neighborhood where people don't necessarily have the same sort of social connections that other folks have. And so my social connections are a little bit poorer. I don't have a mother or grandmother who went to certain places and knows certain people when I'm out there looking for a job. What do we call the social capital? So I don't just have a wealth deficit, I actually have a social capital deficit. And then if you look at the numbers in terms of my neighborhood, you start measuring. The average African-American family that makes $100,000 lives in the kind of neighborhood that is typical for the average white person that makes $30,000. You can see that's a great difference. And when you start thinking about this, when you go from not just the individual, but to the family, to the community, and then you imagine these communities and these families interacting with each other, because African Americans are the most segregated community in this country. And have historically been this most segregated community in this country. Don't ever let anybody draw a comparison for you between, say, African Americans and the immigrant families, the Irish families, the Jewish families. It's not comparable. I can run another for you, but if you guys are interested in reading something, you should check out American Apartheid. It's an excellent one that really goes and gives you the numbers of how hyper-segregated is it called. The African American community. There was a report that recently came out. It was applauding the end of segregation in America. And the good news was that the numbers for African Americans had receded to about where they were in 1920. But African Americans were still the most segregated group of people in this country. White people were less segregated, but that's because Asian Americans and Latino people lived in the neighborhoods. So we have this thing, this wealth gap that's beneath everything. It doesn't really get talked about. How did it get here? How did it happen? This is what I mean when I talk about the ahistorical nature of our conversations. We don't talk about why we're here. We act like it's some great mystery. We walk around, we talk about everything else. Maybe if your father was around, everything would be okay. Maybe if you did this, maybe the black girl stopped having babies, it would be okay. And ignorance of the stats too. Just people just throw things out, because they feel like it. But what we like is a serious interrogation of why things are the way they are. And the fact of the matter is, we know why they are the way they are. And I'll just take you through this, very brief history, which all you guys know. The way we talk about feeling like Cornell, you're in prison, usually, in a place that is rural and usually white. When they take the census to decide who's going to get what district, they include the prisoners in the count. And so Heather and Thompson shows that there were three, at the turn, just when they were about to repeal the Rockefeller laws, there are actually 3 districts in New York that would not have existed if not for the force of mass incarceration. Okay? Guess who was against the repeal of the Rockefeller laws? And not only that, Plunder doesn't end there. In fact, when the federal government goes to calculate what your median income is, so that if you're poorer, you can be eligible for certain federal funds, they count the prisoners too. They count the prisoners who live there, who neither benefit from the vote or neither benefit from the federal funds. And so what you effectively have is African American bodies being housed in prisons, being used as conduits for the energy that falls down from the federal government. This is Plunder again, and so it hasn't stopped. If you looked at the recent housing crisis, redlining was, a lot of people said a long time ago, 50 years ago, done with. Wells Fargo was sued for housing discrimination, and with the plaintiff basically alleged was that Wells Fargo was intentionally targeting African Americans. And not targeting African Americans, they had lower credit scores, not targeting African Americans for any particular ostensible reason, except race. To a lot of people, that's ridiculous. There must have been some other reason. But in the suit, what they did was they ran the numbers. They balanced everything, credit score, wealth, etc. And what they found was, nevertheless, African Americans were for some reason being targeted for these subprime loans. And you say, all right, maybe it's something that the math, we're missing. Maybe there's some sort of variable that we're missing. But they subpoenaed the files from Wells Fargo. And they got the interactions, and what they found was people that were working for Wells Fargo referred to these loans as loans directed towards muddy people, ghetto loans. And so it became very clear in the terminology. And not only that, there was a whole strategy attached to that, wherein certain African American leaders who go unmentioned were tapped to go into African American communities and pitch these loans as wealth building opportunities. Now this is insidious. Because what you have in the African American community is a knowledge that we have been cut out of other wealth building opportunities. And so people are hungry. And so Wells Fargo figures out a way to exploit this with ghetto loans and enrolls African American quote unquote leaders to do part of the exploitation. When you start seeing something that you can trace back from the birth of this country, before the birth of this country, 1619, up till now, we were dealing with a powerful force. And yet, when I hear all this discussion, as I do, about the fate of black boys and the fate of black girls and the fate of whatever black people, black families in this country, that force very often goes curiously unmentioned. People want to talk about everything, income, morals, whatever. And my argument is, the reason why we don't talk about that is because it goes to the very core of who we are. If it's true that we are the beacon of democracy, as we call ourselves, the force that's going to make the world safe for democracy, if it's true that all of that talk is built on plunder, built on the taking of one thing from one group to another, what does that say about us? Who are we? Now, in case for reparations, obviously, it makes it easy for all of this happening, but I think at the end of the day, it leaves us with some really, really profound questions that are not immediately apparent. But there's a reason why every time somebody stands up and says reparations, that person is belittled as though they're, talking crazy, when in fact they're just citing the history of the country they live in. And part of that is because it troubles the order on a very, very, very deep level. My argument, though, is that if we don't begin to deal with our history, I can't, to be clear, tell you what lies on the other side of that mountain. I can't tell you what it means if you face up to yourself, how you reconstitute your identity. But I can tell you what will happen if you do not. Because the problem of not facing up to history is not just restricted to the problem of black people in this country. And we can't deal with the force of white supremacy. I have no idea. I've said this before, and I keep saying, I have no idea how we'll deal with climate change at all. Climate change is nothing but facing up to history. That's all it is. For the past X number of years, we've been doing X, Y, and Z, and it's having this effect. Denialism at its core is a kind of denial. It's a denial of science, definitely, but it's also a denial of history. And if we can't face up to these inconvenient facts, if we get into this habit of deluding ourselves, of lying to ourselves, of pretending to be America, the completely innocent, America, the naive, we are in deep, deep trouble. And it goes way, way beyond just black people. Obviously, I care a lot about that issue. It's an issue that I said has motivated my work for years. But it isn't the only issue. This is a deep-seated narrative. I can talk about that in all reparations. I will talk about that in all reparations. Like I said, I'm here at Cornell University, and I would like to hear from some of the very smart people. Thank you so much. In the manner of, through the lens of manners, as I call it. If you ever hear anybody that says something racist, like the latest climate budget, which will happen in the next 2 weeks or so, I'm sure. The first thing that person says, or the person who's defending them says, he's, well, such and such can't be a racist, they're a good person. He has such a good heart, there's no way he can be a racist. I know him since he was 5 years old, he's such a great person. There's no possible way he can be a racist. He's such a great father, there's no way, he could be a racist. As though, like Thomas Jefferson and all the white supremacists who come to this type of bad hearts, they must have been bad hearts. They could be racist. This is about the heart, because we believe racism to be a disease of the heart. We believe if you are a racist, you are necessarily unqualified, a bad person right off the bat. We basically, taken the connotation of slur somewhere in the neighborhood of child molesting. That's sort of how we regard it, basically. So racism is not something that afflicts an entire society. It is something that, afflicts a certain small group of orcs who live over here in the our society. If you believe racism afflicts orcs, it's very easy to believe that. It's racist. So, my argument that I make, one of the primary things in the case for reparations, is that the force of American racism, the force of white supremacy in this country is not a disease of the heart, it's a disease of the pocketbook. And that is the correct way to understand the plight of African Americans in this country. There is a reason why the most quoted speech from Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" that makes everybody, especially the section of people quote, it's not just those speech, the section of people quote makes everybody feel good. Everybody can get into the idea of little white girls and little black girls holding hands and little, whatever. You guys know the speech. No disrespect to Dr. King, but it's been quoted over and over and over and over and over again. And a lot of his other stuff is a lot less quoted. For very obvious reasons. We can all get into the heart aspect, the idea of being nice to each other. But the thing we can't get into is the idea of how about we stop taking things from black people. And this is, I argue, is the dominant theme in American history. From 1619 up to the present. When enslaved African Americans first came here, enslaved Africans, they arrived on the shore, the idea of unfreedom is not unfamiliar. I'm sure most of you know there was a populism here of indentured service. And indentured service means I pay for my transport to this country, to these colonies, to the Jameson, for instance, by pledging my labor to you for 7 years. If you look at the history of indentured servitude in this country, you will find many things that are shocking. You can find indentured service being the hell you got of them. You can find masters of indentured servants altering contracts to make sure indentured servants serve longer. You can find, in fact, masters gambling with the contracts of indentured servants and trading between them. So much of the things that we would later associate with the institution of enslavement in this country were already present. So Africans arrive, and what you see immediately is not racism as we know it today. Another thing that we like to think about is that somehow it is natural because you have more melanin than me, or I have less melanin than you, because my hair tinks a certain way for me to hate your guts. That's somehow evolutionary, manifestation of something real. Somehow we can educate ourselves. But in fact, racism is a creation of our modern moment. By our modern moment, I mean the past 400, 500 years. The contact between Africans and Europe is not new. It's much older than 400 and 500 years, and yet the tropes that we find, in effect, strangely older here after the slave trade. Funny how it works. And so enslaved Africans come here, and what you see is in a colony like Virginia, or in all of our colonies, where you have this vast amount of land, where people are looking for ways to extract wealth from the land and need a way to do it as efficiently as possible. And it eventually becomes clear one way of doing that is having a permanently bonded population of people who are bonded for life and whose kids are bonded for life. And this can allow for the maximum extraction of wealth. I really wish that Baptiste was here. I know you had to know that other thing. Shout out to the Baptiste. You need an efficient way to extract. This is all this book is about. He talks all about that's 5 issues. You need an efficient way for extracting. But this doesn't just help in terms of economy. It actually offers you a stable basis for democracy, because in a state like Virginia, where you're talking about something like 30% of the people who are living there are in bondage, or you're talking about a state like South Carolina, where at the start of the Civil War, the majority of people are living in bondage, or in Mississippi, where the majority of people are living in bondage, in Louisiana, where something like half of the people are living in bondage, Georgia, Alabama. What you have is you have a bonded working class. You have a group of people whose freedom is automatically restricted, and this allows for a kind of stability and a kind of equality among white people. And so the argument that I make in reparations, and this is nothing new for the historians in the room, is that when you understand slavery, we like to think about it as something that happened in spite of our democracy, or everything would have been okay had we not killed all the Native Americans and enslaved black people. But in fact, we might not exist if we've done those two things. We certainly would not exist as we are today. Come up to the time of the Civil War. And a few years ago, I went on a deep dive into the Civil War. And I visited all these battle parks. Oh, it's really hot. I'm Civil War. I went out to all these battle parks, and this is getting better, but if you visit Civil War battles, one of the things you'll find is everybody wants to talk about everything except what the Civil War is over. So they want to talk about what flanking maneuvers there was. What clothes the average private was wearing, or what rifle they were toting. You ask them, why were you shooting that rifle? No one wants to talk about that, but in fact, and for a long time before I did this deep dive, I thought maybe it was because the history wasn't clear. Maybe there was some sort of intelligent debate to be had about why the Civil War was fought. In fact, there is no intelligent debate at all about why the Civil War was fought. And we know this because if you look at, the people who started the Civil War, the Southerners who initiated the Civil War, to form a nascent Confederacy, were very clear about why they were initiated the Civil War. One can go back and read the Declaration of Secession. Anyway, I had a conversation about this earlier today. If you read the Declarations of Secession for a state like Mississippi, I believe the very first sentence is, our interest is thoroughly identified with the institution of African slavery. I mean, it's the first sentence. There's a reason for why you have it. It's the very first sentence, okay? And it's the same if you look at the documents of secession for South Carolina, for Virginia, for the Confederate States. If you read the cornerstone speech by Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, the cornerstone is black inequality. It's the fact that the natural position for black people is to be as slaves. So there's really no doubt, about why the Civil War was fought. And then you start looking at the numbers. And you consider the fact that in 1860, the dominant export from this country was cotton. Cotton, obviously, extracted by the labor of slaves. You understand that the greatest institution of wealth, more than all our productive capacity in this country put together, all our railroads, all our basic factories, all our everything, was the enslaved bodies of Africans. When you understand that if you wanted to find a region where the largest per capita group of millionaires lived in this country, you would have to go to the Mississippi River Valley down south. That's where you'd find it. I wonder why. It wasn't New York, it wasn't Boston. When you understand that the interstate trade in slaves generated millions and millions of dollars, many times over every year. When you understand that everything was tied to this. Don't just think about the guy who's, literally, holding somebody on his farm. Think about, like, the government, or think about the insurance companies, that have to, offer insurance on a slave. Think about the government that has to deal with a will when a slave master dies, and has to dispense slaves in every direction, depending on what the will says. Think about the social institution of slavery. The fact that in many slaves, all whites, whether they were slave owners or not, had to serve on slave patrols. Think about the journals like DeVoe's Review, where if you walk over to the library, I'm sure Cornell has a nice collection. If you walk into the library, you can see people trading tips on the best way to extract labor from slaves, in much the same way that one might trade tip on a home, on how to expand a patio or something like that. This was an institution, and it was at our core, so much so that 600,000, the numbers are being revised upwards every day, people died in a war. And you have to wonder why. And when we know why. We know why. And yet, when you see that the memory has been so repressed, you wonder what's going on. And even say the extraction didn't end after slavery. They continued. That if you looked at the Jim Crow South, you would find African Americans effectively bonded to the land through the institution of sharecropping. Again, our resources being extracted from them. One of the primary people in my piece is a gentleman by the name of Clyde Ross. And Mr. Clyde Ross lives on the west side of Chicago. And I went into his house. I said, Mr. Ross, where are you originally from? He said, I'm from Cornell, Mississippi. And I said, why did you come to Chicago? And he said, I was seeking the protection of the law. And he has like this thick Mississippi accent, so I'm sorry I misunderstand. I said, what do you mean you were seeking the protection of the law? He said, there was no law in Mississippi. I said, what does it mean that there was no law? He said, there were no white prosecutors. There were no black judges. was saying is basically anybody could at any moment come and take anything from him. Any white person could take anything from him. And that's exactly what happened, if you read the story. And there was no one to appeal to. He was effectively an outlaw, literally outside the law. The law was existed to control him, not to protect him. And so, if you can magnify that beyond Mr. Clyde Ross, who, by the way, is very much alive today. People talk about, oh, anybody making reparations claims is all dead. Mr. Ross is very much alive, just as intelligent as ever. But when you think about that, you're down in outdoor community, whole communities in Mississippi, living outside of the protection of the law. Then if you think about the fact of African Americans coming north into the during the Great Migration, and not finding much more protection under the law in these cities. He talked about segregation. There's some great scholarship on this and the forces at work that made our neighborhoods look the way they look now. And we go through the government policies of redlining, which I do in some detail in that book. You can talk about the misapplication of the GI Bill, which I do in some book. You can talk about the misapplication of housing policy across this country during the 1940s and 1950s, when we have this formation of this great American middle class, how black people were cut out of this. Effectively cut out of all of these programs. And what you'll find, though, even after that, is one of the great forces that kept black people in the ghetto when they tried to move out were the riots by white people. White violence, one of the great forces for restraining African Americans into their neighborhoods. I just want to back up really quickly, because I want to make this clear. I don't want to assume everybody read this piece, but it's very important that people understand housing policy in this country. Housing, as we understand it today, the image that I would cut on when I would see, cut on TV and look at family ties, is the product of government action. It's a product of social engineering. So anybody that, gets up and talks to you about African Americans and says that you want the state to do X, Y, and Z, and you should just laugh at it. I was talking to somebody yesterday, and they were, I don't know, how much of an issue this is for you guys, but the person was saying to me that one of the problems is that people who come to Cornell, African Americans who come here, resent the fact that sometimes people ask them if they are the benefit of affirmative action. And that really rankles some people, but it shouldn't rankle anyone. It shouldn't rankle anyone. The white middle class in this country is the result of state-sponsored affirmative action on a massive scale. On a massive scale. It's a socially engineered middle class. It just didn't exist without it. In the 1930s, we're coming out of the Great Depression, those colors coming in. The folks are looking for a way to make home ownership more attractive and more possible for the masses of people in this country. And what the federal government comes up with through HOLC, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and later through the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, is that they will back loans for people. And what that means is not necessarily they're going to give you a loan. What that means is when a private company decides they'll give you a loan, if you default, the government will take it over. And as you can imagine, that spurns a great, it spurns not just a lot of home loans, but it spurns home loans at very generous terms. So the 30-year mortgage, as we understand it today, for instance, interest rates go down, and suddenly for the masses of Americans, not African Americans, home ownership is available. But why not for African Americans? Because at the same time the federal government did this, it drew up maps for virtually every major city in this country. And you go see these maps today. And in these maps, what you have is basically color-coded sections for who lives where. And where African Americans live, not even necessarily where a majority African American population live. But where, say, one black person had moved onto the block, or two black families had moved onto the block, the color was red. And what that meant was that entire area was ineligible for government-backed loans. Now look, the mortgage industry didn't need much help to be racist. They were racist on their own. I don't want anybody to think like the government forced them into it. There's plenty of literature in there. There's a great quote from the Trade Association for realtors, and they say, but basically what they say is, you should never alter a neighborhood. And the elements that might alter a neighborhood could be, some sort of criminal, some sort of madam who's running a courthouse, or an African American, like a Negro, I guess they would say, or a Negro of means who thinks his success is entitled him to live around white people. So the private sector did not need help, to be racist. So let's just get clear about it. What you have is a kind of collusion. And so at the very moment, you have the greatest wealth-building opportunity in American history taking place, and perhaps in the modern world, African Americans are systematically cut out of it. Everybody know what the GI Bill was? Everybody know what the GI Bill is? It makes me upset. When I see politicians, talk about GI Bill, how great the GI Bill is, and I guess I sort of understand that. But the fact of the matter is, the very same, mechanism that was used to cut African Americans out of these homeowners was used with the GI Bill. The guy who headed up the subcommittee was for the GI Bill in the House. His name was John Rankin. John Rankin was arguably the most racist person to ever serve in Congress. Just real quick with the video, you'll see what I'm saying. He was from Mississippi. He headed up the subcommittee for the GI Bill. And he was deeply concerned that the GI Bill not allow all these African American veterans who were coming back to use the GI Bill to threaten white supremacy in the South. And so the GI Bill was written so that the powers evolved down to the states. So if you wanted to use the GI Bill in Mississippi, and you wanted to buy a house, and you were an African American, you had to go deal with the local representative for the Veterans Administration. And you can imagine what the local representative for the Veterans Administration in Mississippi thought of you. And you wanted to use the GI Bill to further your education, and you were in Mississippi, which at that time had a decent public university system. To say you wanted to go to the flagship college, well, first of all, you might set off a riot. Let's start there. You might set off a riot. But second of all, you had to, again, deal with the local representative. And so, again, you see African Americans being cut out. And the whole time this is happening, remember that African Americans are citizens of this country. And they have taken an oath, they have pledged themselves to the social contract of this country to be citizens, to follow the laws, to pledge their fealty to the government, to go fight in the wars, to be taxed. And yet, if you live in Mississippi, in the 1940s and the 1950s, you were being taxed for the maintenance of universities that you can't attend. You're being taxed for the maintenance of pools that you can't swim in. You're being taxed for a separate but equal public school system. You're being taxed for libraries that won't let you come in and borrow a book. And so the extraction continues. It's not just a matter of you being cut out. You're being cut out, settled, and you're being systematically plundered. As you have been since the birth of this country, before the birth of this country was back. And this continues to this very day. There's a historian down at Temple, Heather Thompson. And she wrote just a really great piece about how historians need to pay more attention to mass incarceration. It's a pretty great article. And I was going through it, and I was like, I got it. And then I got to this section where she talks about mass incarceration and its effects on our democracy, on voting in particular. And it's not just felon disenfranchisement, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with. You're incarcerated in most states, you lose the right to vote right away. I think it's only two states, Maine and maybe it's another one state. Vermont, thank you. I thought it was Vermont. Always take the chance to be wrong. So not only you're in prison usually in a place that is rural and usually white. When they take the census to decide who's going to get what district, they include the prisoners in the count. And so Heather Thompson shows that there were three, at the turn, just when they were about to repeal the Rockefeller laws, there are actually 3 districts in New York that would not have existed if not for the force of mass incarceration. Okay? Guess who was against the repeal of the Rockefeller laws? And not only that, Plunder doesn't end there. In fact, when the federal government goes to calculate what your median income is, so that if you're poorer, you can be eligible for certain federal funds, they count the prisoners too. They count the prisoners who live there, who neither benefit from the vote or neither benefit from the federal funds. And so what you effectively have is African American bodies being housed in prisons, being used as conduits for the energy that falls down from the federal government. This is plunder again, and so it hasn't stopped. If you looked at the recent housing crisis, redlining was, a lot of people said a long time ago, 50 years ago, done with. Wells Fargo was sued for housing discrimination, and what the plaintiff basically alleged was that Wells Fargo was intentionally targeting African Americans. They're not targeting African Americans, they have lower credit scores, not targeting African Americans for any particular ostensible reason, except race. To a lot of people, that's ridiculous. There must have been some other reason. But in the suit, what they did was they ran the numbers. They balanced everything, credit score, wealth, etc. And what they found was, nevertheless, African Americans were for some reason being targeted for these subprime loans. And then you say, all right, maybe it's something that the math, we're missing. Maybe there's some sort of variable that we're missing. But they subpoenaed the borrowers from Wells Fargo. And they got the interactions, and what they found was people that were working for Wells Fargo referred to these loans as loans directed towards mud people, ghetto loans. And so it became very clear in the terminology. And not only that, there was a whole strategy attached to that, wherein certain African American leaders who go unmentioned were tapped to go into African American communities and pitch these loans as wealth building opportunities. Now this is insidious. Because what you have in the African American community is a knowledge that we have been cut out of other wealth building opportunities. And so people are hungry. And so Wells Fargo figures out a way to exploit this with ghetto loans and enrolls African American quote unquote leaders to do part of the exploitation. When you start seeing something that you can trace back from the birth of this country, to before the birth of this country, 1619, up till now, you are dealing with a powerful force. And yet, when I hear all this discussion, as I do, about the fate of black boys and the fate of black girls and the fate of group, whatever black people, black families in this country, that force very often goes curiously unmentioned. People want to talk about everything, income, morals, whatever. And my argument is, the reason why we don't talk about that is because it goes to the very core of who we are. If it's true that we are the beacon of democracy, as we call ourselves, the force that's going to make the world safe for democracy, if it's true that all of that talk is built on plunder, built on the taking of one thing from one group to another, what does that say about us? Who are we? Now, in case for reparations, obviously, it makes it easy for all of this happening, but I think at the end of the day, it leads us to some really, really profound questions that are not immediately apparent. But there's a reason why every time somebody stands up and says reparations, that person is belittled as though they're, talking crazy, when in fact they are just citing the history of the country they live in. And part of that is because it troubles the order on a very, very, very deep level. My argument, though, is that if we don't begin to deal with our history, I can't, to be clear, tell you what lies on the other side of that mountain. I can't tell you what it means if you face up to yourself, how you reconstitute your identity. But I can tell you what will happen if you do not. Because the problem of not facing up to history is not just restricted to the problem of black people in this country. And we can't deal with the force of white supremacy. I have no idea. I've said this before, and I'll keep saying it. I have no idea how we'll deal with climate change at all. Climate change is nothing but facing up to history. That's all it is. For the past X number of years, we've been doing X, Y, and Z, and it's having this effect. Denialism at its core is a kind of denial of science, definitely. But it's also a denial of history. And if we can't face up to these inconvenient facts, if we get into this habit of deluding ourselves, of lying to ourselves, pretending to be America the completely innocent, America the naive, we are in deep, deep trouble. And it goes way, way beyond just black people. Honestly, I care a lot about that issue. It's the issue that I said has motivated my work for years. But it isn't the only issue. This is a deep-seated narrative. I can talk about that in reparations. I wouldn't talk all day about reparations. Like I said, I'm here at Cornell